All right, so today we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Section 3. The title of this is The Birth of the Republican Party. Now, throughout the mid-1850s, the issue of slavery, as well as other factors, split not only our nation, but also the political parties that lead our nation. So this is going to lead to the dissolution of some political parties, but also the creation of one of our two major parties today, and that is the Republican Party. And we're going to talk about how the Republican Party started in the mid-1850s around the issue of slavery. But first we need to talk about a number of other issues. There were several different parties. We were, yes, a two-party system, but there were a number of minor parties that are going to eventually unite around the issue of slavery. And one of these was the Whig Party. Ever since Andrew Jackson in the late 1820s, the Whig Party had formed around the issue of the Bank of the United States. They hoped to preserve the Bank of the United States by stopping Andrew Jackson's destruction of it. And from the 1820s forward, there were a number of Whig presidents, William Henry Harrison, Zachary Taylor, and a number of Whig politicians. So they were entrenched as a kind of formal political party, one of the major two parties at that time. But they split over the issue of slavery. Now, in the 1852 election, because of the division among the Whigs, the Democrat Franklin Pierce became president in 1852. And really, after the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Whig Party split up as well, and that was the attempt to use popular sovereignty to allow people to decide for themselves whether or not a state should be free or slave. And the unfortunate reality of Kansas and Nebraska was that when it came to an issue that important and that divisive, people were not able to do this in a peaceful and democratic way. Another party that we need to know about that became the Republican Party was a group called the KnowNothings. These were a group of nativists. They believed in giving preferential treatment to native-born Americans as opposed to immigrants coming in. They hoped to stop the flow of immigrants to make it more difficult for people to move to this country, in particular targeting Asian Americans coming to the West Coast, but also many Mexican Americans coming up after the U.S. war with Mexico, but also many European immigrants. And so this Know-Nothing party formed around this idea of nativism. They were mostly made up of middle-class, white, obviously, Protestants. And the reason, they opposed immigration, especially people they didn't agree with politically. They especially opposed groups who were Catholic. And they saw Catholicism as a threat to their way of life. In fact, this anti-Catholic sentiment endured. When John F. Kennedy became the first Catholic president, believe me, there was a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. In fact, when the Ku Klux Klan rose to its peak membership in 1925, much of that was around anti-Catholic sentiment. So sometimes we forget that though we like to think of ourselves as tolerant in regards to religion, it's often not the case. And one last point about this group, they called themselves the Know-Nothing Party. They like to think of themselves as a secret society. And they were called the Know-Nothings because of their commitment to secrecy. When people would ask them about their beliefs, they would say they knew nothing. And so, since they wouldn't talk, people just called them the Know-Nothings because that's how they responded to questions. The next party I want to talk about is the Liberty Party. Now, the issue of slavery united all of these different groups together around the Republican Party. The Liberty Party was a group of abolitionists. They hoped to, like Frederick Douglass, pursue an end of slavery through laws. And their vote did sway several different presidential elections, in particular in 1844. The next group is the Free Soilers. You see, all of these people opposed slavery, but for different reasons. The Free Soilers simply opposed the extension of slavery into territories. They just didn't want people bringing slaves with them as they moved west. And they weren't necessarily abolitionists. They didn't care if slavery ended or not. Their concern was over the spread of slavery. You see, they didn't want to have to compete for jobs. They didn't want their people to have to compete with slaves for work. They were concerned about the effect of slavery on wage-based labor. Because if you look at the South, not many people were moving into the South. The South wasn't really industrializing. People couldn't find jobs in factories in the South, and so the South did not develop as quickly. And the Free Soilers, again, were opposed to slavery just purely on economic grounds. Now, the Republican Party formed out of a coalition of Whigs who had divided over the Kansas-Nebraska Act, a number of Northern Democrats who had grown to dislike slavery, as well as Free Soilers who maybe didn't oppose slavery on moral grounds, but opposed the extension of slavery. And then finally, the KnowNothings, who just opposed immigration. Now, this is a very diverse group. We call this a coalition, meaning just because you're a Republican doesn't mean you have the same beliefs necessarily as another Republican. But that party may represent enough of your beliefs to get your support. And it may be the same with the Democrats. Horace Greeley is one of the famous founders of the Republican Party. He was an abolitionist. He hoped, like the Liberty Party, to end slavery by the passage of laws. And so the Republican Party formed, and the major party platform, meaning their number one belief, would be the opposition of slavery and the opposition of the extension of slavery. And so you can imagine when Abraham Lincoln became the first Republican president, how southern states are going to feel about this. Now, the first election where we see Republicans running is 1856. The Republican Party selected the war hero John C. Fremont. He was the very same general who marched into California and declared California an American territory. It would become the Republic of California and then obviously the state of California in 1859. And so they hoped this war hero would bring enough of his fame from his military career. Not only had he led troops into California, he was also a guide along the Oregon Trail. And so he is very famous for his prowess. Now, though Fremont lost the election in 1856, this election showed that the Republicans were to be taken seriously because they did come in a close second. Now, the Democrat James Buchanan won this election in 1856. In fact, had Fremont won in 1856, he might have been the Abraham Lincoln to lead us through the American Civil War, because the South was threatening secession if a Republican president were elected. And obviously when Lincoln was elected, they carried through with their promise. But Buchanan won. And perhaps the only good thing about Buchanan was that he was enough of a baby kisser and a fence rider. He was enough of a compromiser, though maybe he didn't stand for much. But he would not criticize slavery. He would not condemn it like the Republican Party was. And so the South was willing to accept Buchanan as their president. In fact, some consider him one of the worst presidents we've ever had. But perhaps the only thing he was famous for was being able to not upset the southern states. In fact, the South finally did secede while he was still president. After the November election where Lincoln did win, the South immediately announced their secession. And Buchanan, still president, though a lame duck president by this time, still president for a couple months, said, and I quote, "Secession is illegal, but it is illegal for me to do anything about it." And so he refused to do anything as Southern states were seceding. But of course, when Lincoln would be sworn in February of 1861, he would do something about it for sure.